Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about nationalism in Edexcel A-Level Politics. Like the other political ideas videos on the channel, this is going to be a very long video. I'm going to start by having a look at the different types of nationalism, so first giving you an introduction to nationalism, and then looking at liberal nationalism, conservative nationalism, anti- and post-colonialism, and expansionist nationalism. From there, I'm going to then go and have a look at the key thinkers and explain how they kind of really exemplify and you can use them to support these different strands of nationalism. Before finally going to the most important part of the video, where we're going to look at the key principles and agreements in relation to nationalism, and also the key disagreements and divisions. And they're really going to be the basis, the points you can use in your essays and in the exam on nationalism. So we're going to be having a look at nations, the nation state, self-determination, culturalism, racialism, internationalism, and of course the key divisions within those two. The PDF notes you can see on your screen are part of a detailed textbook I've written for nationalism that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website if you're interested, along with some essay plans to help you some detailed essay plans to help you to prepare for this section of the exam. And on the website you can also find loads of other resources to help you in the A-level, including detailed essay plans covering every single part of the course, detailed textbooks doing exactly the same, and a place to sign up for tutoring or some revision webinars that we do every year if that's something you're interested in. But without further ado, let's get into it. So let's have a start. So of course the key different strands of nationalism are liberal nationalism, conservative nationalism, anti and post-colonialism, or anti-colonial nationalism and post-colonial nationalism, expansionist nationalism as well. We're going to look at those in turn, but first it's useful to just have a quick look over what potential essay questions you can get asked on nationalism in the exam. And with the other, as with the other political ideas, they're centrally, they start with to what extent, and they're really focused around the extent of agreement or disagreement within the ideology, within nationalism and between nationalists. And of course, some of those, some of the most likely questions are on state, economy, human nature, or society, in exactly the same way as the core political ideas or other non-core political ideas. But you can also get questions on the core principles. So you see them here: the nation, self-determination, nation state, culturalism, racialism, and internationalism. Even though those last three ones are actually pretty difficult, we're going to go and have a look at how you could potentially structure or some of the key agreements and disagreements in relation to those at the end of the video. Of course, you can also get questions related to the extent of agreement within nationalism overall. So that could be, to what extent is nationalism more united than divided, or highlighting a couple of particular strands of nationalism. So to what extent do liberal nationalists and conservative nationalists disagree? That, I think, is the most likely two that they'd pick out, because they're kind of the ones you can talk the most about. But you could also get something like to what extent to post an anti-colonial nationalist, or to what extent to post an anti-colonialism and conservative nationalists disagree. And of course, there are also some other kind of principles and ideas you can get asked on, as we're going to look at when we look at the key agreements, but the key divisions as well. What are the key divisions within nationalism? Is whether it's inclusive or exclusive, and that's why you get questions like, to what extent is nationalism inclusive or exclusive as well? Another key division is progressive versus regressive nationalism, and again, that's where you get that question. So these might not be the key ideas or principles, but on the specification there to the left, there's some key terminology and things that also need to be covered. And you will have covered this in class, or you should have. And is then, to what extent is nationalism expansion? It's a very difficult question, but one that, if you know the core agreements, you know the strands, and you know the core agreements and disagreements well, you should be able to answer. So yeah, that's some of the key questions that you could get asked, and you should make sure that you should prepare well. But crucially, with all of these political ideas, the way to do well is to know the ideology inside out in relation to everything, and then you'll be able to apply it to different questions that could come up. You should know the different strands really, really well, what they are, the thinkers you can bring in to support them, what they believe, why they believe it, and their core beliefs. And then you should understand the key agreements and principles between the strands, but also the key areas they disagree, and then of course being able to bring in the thinkers to support those as well. And if you know that overall picture really, really well, you should then be able to adapt it to different questions that could come up. So, starting off with an introduction to nationalism then. And nationalism, effectively, if we're going to define it, is the belief that people who share a common national identity should govern themselves in an independent state. So it resists anything that stops groups of people from achieving these nation states and believes that the nation state is the key source of loyalty and belonging for people. So nationalism, it's about nations. People who have this shared, feel that they're in a shared nation and have a sense of belonging, they should politically be able to realise that through a nation state. And that should be independent from imperialism or being dictated to by a monarch who doesn't share that nationhood. Or an imperial power, another nation or state dictating what your nation can do. No, each nation should have that self-determination. They should be able to have their own nation state and be able to rule. Crucially, though, what's really useful to understand is that nationalism is a chameleon ideology, and this was something that British sociologist Anthony D. Smith referred to nationalism as, and similar maybe to populism you might have come across, where it's very flexible. It can be combined with a range of other political beliefs and ideologies on both the left and right, and that's where you'll see in the same way that you see some populists on the people described as populists on the left, like Jeremy Corbyn, but also on the right, like Donald Trump. And in one sense, you might think they've got very, very little in common. It's exactly the same with nationalists. You can have nationalists who are liberals, nationalists who are socialists, and nationalists who are conservatives, and therefore in a lot of senses they have very little in common, or they disagree about a huge amount, and a lot of values. But crucially, we're looking for the key areas where they agree as well, and that's fundamentally on the nationalism bit, the nation. They believe that the nation is key and the nation state is key to how politics should be organised. So, yeah, nationalism can be inclusive of all who share certain values, open to internationalism and the freedom of all, and progressive. However, it can also be exclusive and reject those who don't share a certain culture or history, opposed to internationalism, aggressive and reactionary, as it looks to maintain the status quo or hark back to the past. So there are key divisions because of the fact that it's a chameleon ideology, and that's ultimately the question you're looking to answer. Does that fundamentally mean that there is actually more disagreement than agreement within nationalism, and they agree on very little? Or can we actually say that they agree to a large extent because of a fundamental agreement on some core principles? Again, I'm going to look at some of those kind of arguments you can make on either side at the end of the video. So while all nationalists claim to speak for and support the nation, they disagree sharply over who belongs to the nation, what it represents, and how it should act. Moving on to the strands then, and the first strand we're going to have a look at is liberal nationalism, which emerged in kind of the 18th and 19th centuries, also the late 18th, mid 18th, and 19th century as part of the Enlightenment. And you would have seen we've gone through the Enlightenment looking at liberalism in particular, and there was a period where effectively liberalism and the Enlightenment challenged absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings, which in European politics at the time was the key way where politics was organised. Legitimacy was based on divine right and based on monarchy, and the Enlightenment instead supported individual liberty and the belief that political authority should be based on the consent of the governed, and also in nation states rather than being just based around rulers. So early liberal nationalists agreed that political legitimacy could come from the people who are governed, and that nations had the right to govern themselves, and they opposed therefore multinational empires such as the Ottoman Empire, which denied various ethnic and cultural groups the right to govern. They, of course, also opposed the monarchies, which monarchs might not share their nation, but would make decisions and rule in their own interests rather than the interest of the nation as a whole. And self-determination is really, really key to this. And this is one of the key reasons why liberal nationalism is, we can describe it as progressive. Whereas as we go on later in the video, see there's a key disagreement between this progressive nationalism and the regressive nationalism of other strands of nationalism. So liberal nationalism effectively applies the ideas of liberalism to the state. So just as liberalism argues that individuals should be able to be free and determine their own lives, liberal nationalists apply that then to nations, to the people. They argue that people who share a nation, a group of people, should be able to determine their own political destiny and be able to therefore have their own nation state and rule over themselves. And that's that really key support for national self-determination within liberal nationalism. Crucially, it also means it's progressive and looks forward. It supports this kind of creation of something new and the ability of groups of individuals to determine their own destiny and achieve progress in society and the economy. And that kind of societal progress is, of course, a key principle and belief of liberalism as well. So yeah, in the 19th century, many liberal nationalists campaigned for the creation of independent nation states in places where people were ruled by empires or unaccountable monarchies, and they believed that this national freedom, being your nation, the people you belong to, being um, being free effectively and having that political representation was a necessary condition for individuals to be free as well. So only when people live in a state that reflects their values, represents their interests, and allows them to participate as equal citizens can they truly be free. And that's where we come on to Giuseppe Mazzini, one of our key thinkers, the first key thinker we're going to have a look at, who was a liberal nationalist. And he argued that individuals could only be free and realise their potential if they're within their own nation state. So without a nation, he saw them as left powerless and unable to shape their own future. And that's because he's writing at a time where, so he's effectively Italian, but at the time, all of the different Italian states were ruled either by the Austrian Empire or by different monarchies and authoritarian regimes. They didn't have their own political control and representation of Italy as a nation. And he argued that people were not free as a result. They needed a nation in order to be free, as people are social creatures whose identities and values were shaped by a wider community. And through nationalism and through self-determination and nation state, they could feel part of something with shared values and a moral purpose, whilst that state would also treat them as they'd be active citizens, but also treat them as citizens and protect their rights as well, which was really important. We're going to look at more at Mazzini's thought in more detail later. It's a really key point you can bring in. Liberal nationalism crucially supported the idea of rationalism. We're going to contrast this later on with the culturalism. Effectively, this was the idea that humans are capable of reason, self-government, and could achieve individual and collective progress as a result. And this led to their rejection of arbitrary rule by empires or unelected monarchs, as we looked at. So people should be able to form political communities and nations based on shared principles and govern themselves. People are rational individuals. They can do that. They can create, it's progressive. They could create this new nation and this new political community, this new nation state. Importantly, this influences how they view the state, which they believe should be rationally created to protect the rights of citizens and guarantee freedom. They don't believe that the state should go further than this and seek to kind of impose the ideas of a nation on culture on other people or other nations. It should just protect the rights of its own nation. And they also believe that membership of a nation state was dependent on the rational commitment to these rights and values of the political community, rather than dependent on race, culture, or history. And that's really important because that leads on to this next point. The liberal nationalists are subscribed to inclusive nationalism. So national identity, being part of a nation, isn't based on your ethnicity, your ancestry, your race, or your religion, but it's based on shared political values and active citizenship. So anyone who subscribes to these liberal values subscribes to the core principles, ideas, and values of the nation, and does so actively, is willing to be an active citizen, can be part of the nation regardless of their background. So liberal nationalism is therefore civic, as we'll look at with Rousseau, and inclusive rather than exclusive. It doesn't say, no, only some people can be part of this nation because you're only part of this nation if you've got this shared ancestry or history, or you come from this particular part of the world. Instead, they can create an inclusive nationalism where anyone can join the nation as long as they subscribe to its values and are active citizens. And that leads on a really good example as a thinker you can bring into this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of civic nationalism. And this is the idea that the legitimacy of a nation depends on this active participation of its citizens and their expression of the general will, which is the collective will of the people. And that freedom isn't just, so this is kind of where he's a little bit critical of some classical liberals. And he said that actually freedom isn't just about being left alone by the state, that kind of negative liberty that we looked at. It's by participating actively in shaping the laws of the nation and the community each individual is part of. And if individuals participate, they're active citizens, and they together communicate this general will of the majority of the population and what they want, what the nation wants, what's their interest, then they can be truly free. So in this sense, of course, as we looked at, the nation is inclusive. Anyone who committed themselves to these shared values and took part in its democratic process, and that's really key. Liberal nationalism believes in democracy, could be part of a nation. It's very much inclusive. And Rousseau also reject this idea of national identity and membership of a nation being tied to race, language, or ancestry. Of course, there are other forms of nationalism within the United States, if you look at Trump, for example. However, in many ways, we can look at the US as a good example of a liberal nationalist state. It's been called by many people a melting pot. The US Constitution is based on a lot of liberal values of liberty, democracy, and the protection of rights. And theoretically, anyone can join that nation state. It's a history, it has a deep history of immigration. The nation state is inclusive and includes anyone who commits themselves to the values and is an active citizen. Of course, there are some complicated, there's some obviously complications that slavery being the chief one, in terms of actually in reality whether the US actually accepted everybody in terms of citizenship. But at least that's the idea behind the United States, or the story that the founders told themselves, that anybody could join, because it's based in the nationhood. The idea of the nation is based on these shared values of freedom, liberty, democracy, the protection of rights. It's not based on nativism, or it's not based on a particular race or culture or belonging or ancestry, for example, particularly as the US was founded. The United States, at least, not, of course, not the actual continent of America, and who was originally there, but the United States was founded based on immigration, in particular from Europe. Crucially, the final thing we're going to have a look at in relation to liberal nationalism is that it doesn't outright reject internationalism. This is, of course, going to be different compared to the other types of nationalism we're going to have a look at. Instead, they actually believe that liberal nationalism translates into liberal internationalism. So Mazzini, for example, argued that Europe should be based on a loose federation of nation states who had a shared commitment to liberal values. And liberal nationalism argues that the world should be organised around independent, self-governing nation states which have autonomy and respect liberal values. He argues that the vast majority of the time they'll just leave each other alone to pursue their own goals and interests. They are fundamentally, they're nationalists. Their main vision is around nationalism. But they also do believe that this translates into liberal internationalism, because you have a number of liberal nationalist states who subscribe to the same ideas and the same liberal values of freedom, democracy, free trade, capitalism, for example. You can then have international organisations to promote these liberal values of peace, democracy and human rights, where there can be cooperation between these states. And they believe that through international organisations which help cooperation between nation states across borders for their mutual benefit, but they also believe in these international organisations, this cooperation, to help poorer nations uplift themselves, as economic cooperation and global economic growth is ultimately beneficial for all states. That's just, they do have this internationalist vision as well. They don't simply just focus on their own nation state. I believe that there should be no kind of cooperation or relationship between nation states. They do believe that there can be this cooperation, and that cooperation, this internationalism, is to the benefit of all. And they also believe that sometimes these international organisations need to sanction certain states if they infringe upon liberal values of another state or its citizens. And this leads to their strong support for institutions such as the European Union and United Nations, which are key liberal internationalist institutions which do this work of cooperation based on liberal values of peace, human rights and democracy, and seek to also uplift states if they're poorer or struggling compared to other states. But also, of course, not completely opposing their will on these nation states. It's still about leaving nation states alone. They still believe in that self-determination, but they believe there can be cooperation within that context based on liberal values. The next strand we're going to have a look at then is conservative nationalism, which emerged partly as a reaction to the emergence of liberal nationalism, because it saw it as dangerous and a destabilising threat to kind of history and the status quo. And conservative nationalists effectively feared that a nation state based on rationalism, this liberal idea that you could create a nation state through kind of shared values, and this inclusive nationalism where anyone could join, they saw that, conservative nationalists saw that as a threat to stability, tradition and order. And they argued that actually the nation and the nation state should be based on the culture, identity and traditions of the past and of the status quo. And this reflected somewhat their more pessimistic view of human nature. They didn't believe that people were rational and could therefore construct a kind of ideal state based on shared values. Instead, they believed that people were emotional, irrational, and therefore needed the guidance and shared identity of culture. And that's really important. They believe in culturalism. So it's rooted, for conservative nationalism, is rooted in history, culture and tradition rather than reason or abstract principles. They see themselves as very much rooted in the present and what's already there. And that links into the fact that conservative nationalism should be understood as exclusive nationalism. So unlike liberal nationalism, which sees national identity as kind of civic, it's about involvement, active participation and sharing the values of the nation. Conservative value nationalism doesn't see it as open in this way or inclusive in this way. Instead, it defines a nation through shared history, culture, traditions, and a common way of life. So it's not a political construct that anyone can join. They think that nations are already there. There's already existing communities who have nations. You can't create something, or people can't join it. It can't necessarily, can't easily join it. It can't be completely inclusive. It's something that a person has already and binds them together based on the past. It's not something that can be chosen. Conservative nationalists didn't completely reject the idea that outsiders could join the nation, but it's very difficult to do so effectively. Foreigners need to assimilate and adopt the real cultures and practices and history of the nation. Of course, that takes a long time. It's not something where you can just adopt the values and subscribe to the values and actively participate. It's very difficult because it's about an existing community, and it's very difficult to, conservative nationalists argue, it's difficult to assimilate and integrate into that community. So they have to be kind of earned over a long time. You see that in something like Norman Tebbit's in the 90s cricket test, which of course at the time and since has garnered a lot of, it was very divisive at the time and garnered a lot of criticism, but effectively what he said was that he questioned the loyalty of immigrants to Britain, many of whom of course are identified as British, but asking which national cricket team they supported. And he suggested those who continue to support non-Britain, effectively continue to not support Britain or England and supported India or Pakistan, lacked full commitment to British identity and shouldn't be considered British. And this is influenced by the fact that conservative nationalism is exclusive and tries to protect, it speaks of itself as protecting the nation from external threats, and it's very difficult. It's about the existing community, the existing culture, and it's not something that can be easily joined. We can look at the Conservative Party under Cameron in many ways as an example of exclusive nationalism. Cameron emphasised British values as essential to national identity, and a belief that immigrants could only become part of the national community if they actively adopted these values and the culture as well. And he acknowledged that immigration could bring its benefits, but argued that multiculturalism has failed and there had to be this integration into British culture and British society, and that was very difficult, effectively. His government introduced policies that encouraged assimilation, and they also restricted immigration and promoted national unity through a shared culture. And it shows how conservative nationalism maintains the national identity is not something that can be automatically acquired. It must be earned through loyalty and conformity. And that's this idea that liberal nationalism is inclusive, conservative nationalism is not. It's exclusive. It's based on membership of a community, of a nation, and that membership is based on the past, on tradition and culture, and it's something that's already there. And though people can join, it's very difficult to do so. A key conservative nationalist thinker to bring into this is Johann Gottfried von Herder, and his key idea of cultural nationalism. And Herder effectively rejected the idea that nations could or should be based on abstract principles or rational consent. So he rejected that liberal nationalism, and instead he believed that each nation was different with its own unique cultural character, shaped by its own language, culture, and history. And he argued that national identity should be rooted in this historic, current cultural life, in the practical, the present. It looked back in many ways. It was regressive, not artificial. It couldn't be artificially created through civic nationalism. The nations weren't artificial or changeable. Each had its own culture and way of seeing the world, and that should be protected and respected. Central to this was his idea of the people, the Volk, in German, and so effectively he argued that the people were the Volk were the true foundation of the nation, whose shared language, culture, and traditions gave the nation its unique character. This idea that it's based on the past, it's something that can't be artificially created. And the Volksgeist effectively is the national spirit, and that represented the collective soul or identity of the people. And this is every nation, he believed, had its own unique cultural character and own unique national spirit that you could see in national institutions, art, in its culture and its traditions. For example, he believed that the role of the state was to nurture this existing spirit, which it associated with an existing group of people. Of course, Herder was partly talking about Germany at the time and supporting German nationalism against imperialism at the time, and he encouraged the idea that nations and Germany should pursue its own distinctive cultural path, free from foreign domination or imitations. There's that support there for self-determination, but it should be that self-determination, the nation state, for an existing nation that has its own existing people, its own Volk, its own existing national spirit, Volkgeist, and it therefore got its own unique cultural character already. So now we get on to regressive nationalism, and this is difficult. I know some teachers kind of really put this into expansionist nationalism, some put it into conservative nationalism. For me, it's kind of somewhere in between. So as you'll see, I'll explain how it can be kind of Maurras kind of can be used for this kind of conservative nationalism and this extreme form of conservative nationalism, but also to support expansionist nationalism as well. So all forms of conservative nationalism are in some sense regressive, as we've spoken about. Rather than trying to create something new, they look to the past and value maintaining traditional national history. However, regressive nationalism goes much further. So all of them are regressive. This idea of kind of something that has been described as regressive nationalism represents a more extreme, reactionary and xenophobic version of conservative nationalism. So whilst traditional conservatives, or these conservatives we've looked at, may wish to preserve national identity, regressive nationalism is really about actively seeking to revive a glorified mythical version of the past, which they see as kind of being corrupted by foreign influence. And it presents the nation in absolute sacred terms and demands complete loyalty to its culture, to its values and traditions. So it's more extreme, and it does this by defining it in opposition to outsiders. It portrays kind of immigrants, minorities, and supranational institutions as a bit of a threat to this national purity and cohesion, and this can lead to exclusionary and authoritarian forms of nationalism that go beyond cultural pride and actively kind of impose this idea of the nation and suppress dissent through doing so. With this emphasis on national superiority, unity, and strength, this often leads imperialism to imperialism and colonization, as nations kind of seek to assert their dominance on the global stage. So it's this idea that not only do they believe that the nation is based on this shared culture and history and tradition, they believe that that culture, values, and civilization is superior, and often racially superior as well, as we're going to have a look at those. That's more associated with expansionist nationalism, but also some of these more extreme versions of conservative nationalism. They believe that their nation is completely superior to others, and that they use that to justify the conquest or control of other territories as a means of spreading that national identity or values. And crucially, that racism comes into that, as colonized people are viewed as inferior and uncivilized, whilst the nation that does that, this imperial power, is effectively viewed as doing the right thing because it has this national superiority. It's spreading its kind of cultural superiority and values, and often racial superiority as well. Which is also seen as an effective way to strengthen the nation at home by uniting people around a common mission, asserting global prestige, and accessing resources to support national power. So there's of course an economic element to it as well, and this regressive nationalism can be seen in the imperialism of the 19th and 20th centuries. For example, in the British Empire being a really key example of that. It was driven by a belief in British cultural, racial, and moral superiority, and it presented to itself as this expansion as a civilizing mission. It was bringing its superiority to what it called lesser peoples. That's that racist element to it. He used this to justify economic exploitation and the suppression of local cultures, for example, in India, but also across the British Empire. And you see this with all empires in the period, or at least a lot of these European empires in the period, where they're really displacing traditional industries, traditional traditions, and replacing them with Western British education and legal system, which they see as superior. Of course, it was also important in fostering unity at home. For example, during the Boer War, I think it was the 1900 election was effectively just won by the Conservative Party on the single issue of the Boer War. A key thinker then we can bring in is Charles Maurras, and of course, as I mentioned, for me, he can be used to support both conservative nationalism and expansionist nationalism. And he developed the idea of integral nationalism. This is the spec highlighted. This is a key one of his ideas. And this was an intensely emotional form of nationalism where individuals are encouraged to kind of submerge themselves completely in to the nation. He believed that individuals should not see themselves as autonomous beings, but as members of a collective national body to which they owe complete loyalty. And that's based on he's French. He's effectively writing, I think it was kind of after Prussian invasion of France and an occupation of France, and effectively he looked back to before the French Revolution, to Louis XIV in particular, and he argued that his authoritarianism and the kind of real imposition of the French nation and the idea that the nation comes before anything and individual autonomy isn't important. That's of course a key difference with liberal nationalism as we talk about that. He believed that that was the kind of the high day of the most powerful France had ever been, and that democracy and republicanism since the French Revolution had led to the decline of France, and therefore he wanted to go back to this authoritarianism, real primacy of the nation, and effectively this integral nationalism rejected liberal ideas and individual rights and reasoned debate, instead promoting obedience, unity, and hierarchy. It glorified the nation and called on citizens to completely sacrifice their own interests for the national good. And now, of course, it was a very extreme version of nationalism that led to the purging of internal enemies, including liberals, Democrats, and minority groups that he considered disloyal. It wasn't a civic version of nationalism at all. It was highly authoritarian and exclusive. And key to this was the military. It was militarism. And he believed this was really key to kind of garnering a national spirit and to national strength. And military power was not just about defence, it was about forging this sense of national purpose, sacrifice through things like national service and authoritarian rule. And this aligned with his view that national identity should be enforced, not debated, as strength was the foundation of a healthy nation. And particularly this militarism is where we can link him in and use him as a thinker for expansionist nationalism alongside conservative nationalism. So expansionist nationalism is the most exclusionary, regressive, militarized, and irrational form of nationalism. It led to violent imperialism and wars of aggression driven by a sense of national superiority. And what we can effectively see is that conservative nationalism is a little bit of a spectrum, where you have the most extreme version of conservative nationalism are quite close actually to expansionist nationalism. That's why we can use Marras as a thinker for both of them effectively. Chauvinist nationalism is something I mentioned in the specification as a key element of this expansionist nationalism. It's similar to this kind of really regressive nationalism we looked at in relation to conservative nationalism as an extreme and aggressive form of regressive nationalism, which asserts the absolute superiority of one nation over others. It's rooted in this idea of national superiority, moral superiority, cultural superiority, and usually racial superiority. And it believes that this superiority gives it the right to dominate others. It's fueled by these kind of often myths of past military triumphs and this idea of a national destiny. And we're going to look in a second of how the Japanese Empire, but also Nazi Germany, are examples of that. And it's not concerned with self-determination or freedom of others. It's concerned with its own national strength, its own what it perceives as its own national national kind of destiny. It's irrational, it's emotional, it's exclusionary, and it effectively is really closely linked to militarism and authoritarianism, but also into imperialism, as we're going to look at. So yeah, it's underpinned by racial and ethnic superiority, and it's based on this idea of militarism, the glorification of the nation, and glorification of its military strength and ability effectively to be an imperial power and impose what it sees as its kind of national superiority on other states. So yeah, it led to violent imperialism as these powerful nations sought to expand their influence and control over others. It didn't believe that all people had the right to self-determination. Instead, it believes that only certain nations were truly fit to govern, and it saw itself as this nation, as they saw this idea of national superiority. So it's very exclusive and irrational. And weaker or less civilized nations, which obviously wasn't actually the case, but it justified other nations as less civilized nations and saw them as inferior, and therefore justified imperialism, the subjugation and colonialism over these other nations. It turned into a justification of conquering and ruling others, which is particularly evident in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with European imperialism, and argued effectively about this national mission. Some nations had a historical mission and natural right to dominate others, and it distorted history, propaganda, and racist ideology to support its claims. Expansionist nationalism completely rejected self-determination. We're going to look at that when we look at some of the key disagreements later on of colonized individuals, and they were denied any kind of agency or identity or nationhood themselves. Examples then of expansionist nationalism is Japanese imperialism, for example. There's obviously lots of examples. We could use any kind of European imperialism as well in the period. But Japanese imperialism in the early 20th century is a clear example of expansionist and chauvinistic nationalism driven by this idea of racial and cultural superiority. It was influenced by the belief that Japan was a unique and superior civilization that was destined to lead Asia, and it pursued a kind of an aggressive uh, policy of military expansion based on this idea of national superiority. And it was used, this kind of idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, was used. This was the empire it created and it claimed to liberate Asian nations from Western imperialism based on its own national superiority. And in practice, was just Japanese domination. We saw that in the invasion of Manchuria, Korea, and China, which were extremely violent, marked by racial hierarchy and the suppression of local populations. It's really based on this idea of national superiority, national pride, military glorification, and loyalty to the emperor. Nazi Germany is exactly the same. It's one of the most extreme and violent forms of expansionist nationalism in history, and under Hitler, the Nazi regime promoted a racist and militaristic ideology centered on racism, effectively, on Aryan racial superiority, and the need for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. So there's this idea of this kind of national destiny, this idea that Germany and the Aryan race are superior. There's this idea of national superiority, which is bolstered by cultural superiority and racial superiority. And that drove this expansionist nationalism. Hitler argued that the German nation had the right to expand eastwards by conquering Slavic lands and removing or exterminating those deemed racially inferior. And nationalism was built on this mythic history of militarism, anti-Semitism, and totalitarian control. And similar to John Maris talked about nationalism, it involved this kind of complete subordination and submergence of the individual to the nation, effectively. It led to the Second World War and the Holocaust, as Nazi Germany sought to assert its dominance, its national superiority through violent conquest, genocide, and the total rejection of the sovereignty and identity of other nations and peoples. Moving on now then to the final strand we're going to have a look at, and that's anti or post-colonialism. So we're going to break that into two and first look at anti-colonialism or anti-colonial nationalism, which emerged in the 20th century as a powerful reaction against this expansionist nationalism, against this imperialism and foreign domination across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean in particular. And it rejected the legitimacy of colonial rule and of imperial powers, and they had this idea of their civilizing missions and national superiority, which is of course linked to racial hierarchy and their ideas of racial superiority. And anti-colonial nationalists argued that colonized peoples had their own distinct cultures, histories, and identities, and the right to self-determination. It's therefore an inclusive and rational form of nationalism that fought against the expansionist nationalism, which was exclusive and irrational. Colonial rule was not only politically oppressive, but also culturally destructive. So it erased indigenous identities and nations and enforced a sense of inferiority. And anti-colonialism sought to call for the creation or restoration of nation states in which colonized people could exercise self-determination and recover their nations and national pride and build a future independent of this colonialism which had denied them nationhood. Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian independence movement is a really good example of this. So he led this Indian independence movement against British rule, rejected imperial domination, argued that India was a distinct nation with its own civilization, values, and a right to self-rule. And he promoted Swaraj, self-governance, not just for political independence, but also to find moral and cultural autonomy from the West and from Britain in particular. They combined, of course, non-violent resistance with the revival of Indian traditions to assert this national identity and pride. And it was really rooted in the belief that this expansionist nationalism, this colonial rule, was politically oppressive and spiritually and culturally damaging as well. And that true liberation could only be achieved through self-determination. That's why we're starting to see some of these similarities between post-anti-colonial nationalism and liberal nationalism, which of course we're going to look at when we look at the key agreements and disagreements. Marcus Garvey, the final key thinker then, we haven't had a look at then, it's this key idea of black pride. So he was one of the most influential figures in anti-colonial and black nationalist thought, and he emphasised the importance of black pride, encouraging African people and those of African descent across the world to reject the imposed colonial mentality and ideas that viewed them as inferior and dominated them. And he urged black communities across the world to take pride in their race, culture, heritage, and history and traditions as well, and see beauty in their strength and identity. His slogan, "Black is Beautiful," became a powerful message of empowerment for anti-colonial nationalist, and he criticised the way that Western colonialism and racism had instilled a sense of shame and self-hatred in black people, and argued that psychological liberation was essential for political freedom. Very closely linked to anti-colonial nationalism is post-colonialism or post-colonial nationalism, which emerged after the end of empires. So we can see they're very, very, very closely linked, but effectively we can see anti-colonial nationalism as fighting against empires, and post-colonial nationalism emerging after that had been successful, after the end of empires. And it emerged as leaders of newly independent states sought to forge a new sense of national identity and unity. This is, of course, a very, very difficult task because European colonial powers, particularly at the Berlin Conference, I think it was in 1884, that began that scramble for Africa, effectively often drew borders between states arbitrarily. You can see a lot of straight lines in the Middle East, in Africa as well, often cutting across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. And that made it very difficult for the post-colonial nationalist leaders, who had to try and build a national identity from a population that was often divided between different groups, had very different nations and shared histories. So the only kind of history it had as a single people was a shared experience of colonial rule a lot of the time. Post-colonial nationalism can therefore be seen as progressive and inclusive, as it sought to create this new identity and this new idea of nationalism to grant legitimacy to these new nation states and transcend these cultural divisions and bring people together. And Nyerere in Tanzania is a really good example of this. So after independence from colonial rule in 1961, just to kind of highlight the real difficulty of this post-colonial nationalism, Nyerere faced the challenge of uniting a country composed of over 120 ethnic groups, each with its own distinct language and traditions. To do this, he sought to kind of create this idea of nationalism, and he introduced the idea of Ujamaa, a form of African socialism that emphasised collective welfare, rural development, and self-reliance. And this was this idea of the shared values and culture and ideas that were effectively created to try and unite the nation. And he also promoted Swahili as a national language to do this, deliberately avoiding privileging of kind of one particular cultural or ethnic group and their language. And that helped to create a kind of shared national identity. So this kind of really inclusive and progressive nationalism aimed to transcend tribal loyalties and create a society built on equality and cooperation. So Tanzania, of course, faced long-term economic struggles, but it has largely avoided the ethnic violence civil war that plagued many other post-colonial African states in the period. Post-colonial nationalism is very closely linked to socialism. It drew on socialist thought, as many nationalist leaders quite rightly saw global capitalism as deeply intertwined with imperialism and colonialism, and a key reason for colonial domination and expansionist nationalism. As a result, they often drew on socialist thought, which clearly opposed global capitalism, to try and create something new and create nations in the wake of colonialism, effectively. So leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Nyerere, as we looked at in Tanzania, combined this kind of idea of nationhood and nationalist rhetoric with socialism, with socialist policies, and argued that independence would be meaningless unless it led to economic emancipation as well. And they tried to use the power of the state. This is a kind of key point you can bring into your economy essays, to create states and economies based on these kind of socialist values of equality and solidarity in particular. Again, it reflects the fact that post-colonial nationalism, like liberal nationalism, is progressive and sought to create something new. It's not just about breaking free from colonial rule, but creating an inclusive society and creating a new idea of national identity. Nkrumah in Ghana is a good example of how post-colonial nationalism sought to do so and drew on socialist ideas. He argued that political freedom was meaningless without economic freedom, and viewed global capitalism as a continuation of colonial exploitation, and therefore sought to kind of fight against it and replace it with a socialist system based on solidarity and cooperation and real state-led development that you saw in a lot of African countries after the colonial period. And his government introduced an ambitious plan for industrialization, education, and infrastructure, and nationalized key industries to give the state control over economic resources. The final key part of post-colonial nationalism we're going to have a look at then is Pan-Africanism and how it linked to socialist internationalism, but also internationalism as a whole. So post-colonial nationalism gave rise to Pan-Africanism, which sought to unite African people across borders in a shared struggle against the legacy and continued impact of colonialism and racism. Garvey was really key to this, promoting the idea that Africans across the globe, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, were one people. He argued that African progress was only possible if the cultural differences between different African communities and different African nations were put aside, and ethnic differences as well, and they as a result united in a common purpose. So Pan-Africanism sought to be inclusive, rejecting nationalism cultural loyalties in favour of a broader African identity. This was also linked to socialist internationalism, a key element of key type of internationalism, similar to liberal nationalism, as post-colonial African leaders supported solidarity between oppressed people across the world and sought to work with other post-colonial nations to resist imperialism and global capitalism, which they saw as a key kind of legacy of expansionist nationalism that maintained in the post-colonial period. So post-colonial nationalism didn't reject internationalism. Instead, it embraced international cooperation between post-colonial states to achieve equality and resist domination and economic exploitation. That's one of the similarities we can see between post-colonial nationalism and liberal nationalism. Okay, as I mentioned at the start of the video, we're going to have a look at nationalism and the different parts of the notes in a different way round compared to some of the other political ideas. We're now going to have a look at the thinkers, look at their ideas in detail. We've already kind of given a real introduction to a lot of their ideas, but then we would have covered effectively the key content and the key ideas of each strand, and that will be then really useful when we're then going to effectively see how we can apply those to analysing key agreements or disagreements within nationalism. So, starting off then with Rousseau, who is very clearly a liberal nationalist. So Rousseau was a French political theorist writing during the Enlightenment, as we looked at, and that of course emphasised reason, liberty, and challenged monarchy, and absolute monarchy, particularly in the period. He's best known for his work, The Social Contract, in which he developed the idea of the general will, which we're going to have a look at as one of his key ideas that the exam board and the specification have highlighted. Rousseau is considered a liberal nationalist because he argued that a legitimate state has to be based on this general will and on the active participation and consent of its citizens, and that political freedom could only be secured through self-rule, self-determination by a unified national community. His vision of nationalism was civic, inclusive, and rational. His concept of the general will was central to his political theory and vision of liberal nationalism. And he argued that a government can only be legitimate if it reflects the collective will of the people, rather than the interests of a monarch or ruling elite. This general will was not simply the sum of individual interests that were tallied up. Instead, it was kind of the shared moral and political aims of a group of active, engaged citizens. And that's, I think, what really made it this idea of nationalism. It's the idea of a general national will. What does this group of people as a nation, what unites them? And what do they fundamentally believe? And it would be far more effective, he argued, at choosing a government that would serve their interests and protect their rights than a monarchy would. And that's his real liberal nationalist criticism of the existing system. So he's therefore a strong believer in national self-determination and the liberal belief in the effectiveness of government by consent, which is key to guaranteeing equality and freedom. And he believed that nations, just like individuals, should be free to decide their own futures. And it's very much linked to civic nationalism, which we've already had a look at. In fact, we're going to look at a tiny bit more detail here, which is the idea that the legitimacy of a nation state depends on the active participation of its citizens. And this is very much links into his idea, the liberal idea of inclusive nationalism. It's a really good thinker you could bring in to illustrate this and as an example of this. So yeah, the nation state depends on the active participation of its citizens and the expression of this general will, understood as the collective will of the people. And freedom isn't achieved by being left alone, like some classical liberals believe. He's a liberal nationalist. He believed that freedom is effectively achieved by participating in the laws of the nation, and therefore the nation state is constructed and reflects the general will of the population, and therefore serves their interests, protects their rights. So yeah, the nation's inclusive. Anyone who commits himself to the shared values of the nation and actively participates in the democratic processes could belong. And this was linked into the fact that he, like all liberal nationalists, rejected the idea of national identity being tied to race, language, ancestry, or culture. Instead, it's rooted in shared civic life, so that's active participation and mutual responsibility. The next thinker we're going to have a look at then is Giuseppe Mazzini, who is a liberal nationalist. I know that some teachers and some kind of parts of the specification say that he has some conservative ideas, which I think is true. But I think overall, most textbooks, most teachers agreed that he should be considered and used as an example for liberal nationalism. So Mazzini is a key figure in 19th century European nationalism and one of the leading voices in the movement for Italian unification and nationhood. So he was writing at a time when Italy wasn't Italy. It was divided into separate states under the control of foreign empires, such as the Austrian Empire, or ruled by effectively the Pope or autocratic monarchies. And in response, in 1831, he founded Young Italy, which is a revolutionary organisation that aimed to unite Italy into a single independent republican nation state. He was a liberal nationalist who believed that nations were natural communities with a moral purpose, and that individuals, crucially, could only really realise their freedom and identity through active membership of a free and self-governing nation, so through self-determination. We've already looked at one of his key ideas that people could only be free in a nation state, the key kind of foundational idea of nationalism as a whole. He argued that people are social and moral creatures, and effectively they can only be free and realise this potential if they're within a nation state. As without it, they're left powerless and unable to shape their own future, as they're effectively being dictated to by another nation or a monarch or an imperial power. But within a nation, they can participate and determine their own future because effectively the state is serving the interests of the nation and of them, and that's what the nation state and self-determination comes in. And you wrote, in Duties of Man, without country, you have neither name, token, voice, nor rights, no admission as brothers into the fellowship of peoples, you are the bastards of humanity. And this idea that people can only be free, can only fully realise themselves as part of a nation and through self-determination in their own nation state. So through nationalism, they could feel part of something with shared values and a moral purpose, whilst there would also be a liberal state that would give them the freedom to be active citizens, shaping their own futures. And crucially, he's a liberal nationalist because his nationalism wasn't based on ethnicity or race, but on a common moral purpose and shared commitment to values and to history and culture. And it was inclusive, progressive, and liberal. Again, linked somewhat to this idea of active participation that Rousseau sets out, Mazzini believes really in action. He kind of opposed these Enlightenment thinkers who kind of sat there and wrote stuff and argued that nationalism had to be rooted in practical action and sacrifice. And his idea of thought and action argued that the belief in national self-determination and freedom aren't enough. You have to actually actively achieve it, actively kind of pull yourself together as a nation and really work to achieve it. And this was obviously linked to his founding of Young Italy, which called on citizens, particularly young citizens, to rise up against tyranny and fight for a united, democratic Italy. And he rejected detached rationalism, and this reflected his romantic and emotional vision of nationalism. So he was very much an inclusive nationalist who believed there could be this creation of a state based on shared values, but he also believed that you need to actively participate, you need to actively create that. The next thinker we're going to have a look at then is von Herder, who's a conservative nationalist. He was a German philosopher and political theorist writing in the late 18th century. And in contrast to liberal nationalists who saw the nation as a political community that could be created and based on shared values and consent, as we had a look at, he's a conservative and cultural nationalist who believes that nations were organic cultural entities naturally formed through shared language, traditions, customs, and history. So each nation had its own unique cultural character and should be able to express its own identity. We've already had a look at these in quite a bit of detail when we looked at the start of conservative nationalism. But effectively, the two key ideas of von Herder are cultural nationalism and folk, the people. And effectively, he strongly supported cultural nationalism. He rejected the idea that the liberal nationalist idea that nations could be created based on abstract principles and values and based on rationalism, and instead believed that national identity and nations are rooted in what's already there, the existing historic current cultural life of a people. They can't be artificially created. So nations aren't artificial or changeable. Each has its own culture and way of seeing the world, and key to that is the people. And the national spirit, the Volksgeist. Effectively, the people are the foundation of the nation. The nation is their shared language, culture, and traditions that give the nation its unique character. And this national spirit effectively is that manifestation of that, is what the nation is, and it's reflected then in culture, in its kind of institutions, art, traditions, and culture of that specific nation. And the role of the state isn't to try and create something new, as liberal nationalists somewhat do. Instead, is to kind of give self-determination to this existing group of people and allow them to pursue their unique path, their unique cultural character. Charles Maurras is, as I mentioned, you can use him for kind of extreme conservative nationalism or expansionist nationalism. And I recommend using him as a thinker effectively to support both, particularly as expansionist nationalism otherwise doesn't have its own thinker. So he was a French political theorist and founder of Action Française movement in the late 19th and early 20th century in relation to the Dreyfus affair. He was effectively writing in the aftermath of France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in the late 19th century. And this led to national humiliation and also a perceived decline of France in political instability. And in response, he articulated a very authoritarian and conservative national ideology that emphasised loyalty to the nation, and in many ways harked back to Louis XIV. So yeah, it's a very extreme, exclusive form of nationalism, as we looked at, known as integral nationalism, which rejected democracy, liberalism, and individualism in favour of the nation and national unity, national superiority being by far the most important thing. The idea that people should completely submit themselves to the nation state, which comes above all else. So one of his key ideas is integral nationalism that he spoke of. So he's effectively a very regressive nationalist, so quite an extreme nationalist, and that's why he can be seen as kind of on the extreme end of conservative nationalism, but that of course also goes into expansionist nationalism a bit as well. So he believes that individuals should not see themselves as autonomous individuals, but as members of a collective national body to which they owe complete loyalty, and they can completely subordinate themselves to the state, to the nation, and see themselves solely as part of that nation, and that's their national mission. As I mentioned, he looked back to the authoritarianism and success in his eyes, which he saw of Louis XIV. So integral nationalism rejected liberal ideas of individual rights and reasoned debate, and instead promoted complete obedience to the state and hierarchy. Of course, it glorified the nation. This idea of national superiority was certainly there that we had a look at, and called on citizens to sacrifice their personal interests for the national good. And of course, this also led to some violence against internal enemies, including immigrants, for example, minority groups that he considered disloyal. So it's a highly exclusive and authoritarian version of nationalism, and it also linked into his strong support for militarism, where he effectively saw military power and national service and the military as really key to nationalism, to national strength, national unity, and national identity. And this made his form of nationalism both reactionary and aggressive, and it would later influence the rise of fascist and ultranationalist movements in the 20th century. The final thing we're going to have a look at then is Marcus Garvey, who belongs to the strand of post-colonial, anti-colonial nationalism. He was a Jamaican political activist and writer who became a leading figure in the global black nationalist and Pan-African movements in the early 20th century. He was writing and organising during a period of widespread colonial rule, racial segregation, and white supremacy, and he sought to empower people of African descent across the world by promoting black pride. So we're going to look at Pan-African unity, as we'll also look at an economic independence. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and was a fierce critic of colonialism, arguing that black people could only achieve dignity and freedom by rejecting white domination and reclaiming their own identity. And he called for the creation of independent black nations and promoted the idea that African people were one people united by a shared history and destiny. As we looked at, black pride is really a key one of his ideas. He encouraged African people and those of African descent across the world to reject the colonial mentality that designated them as inferior and dominated them, and encouraged them to take pride in their race, culture, and heritage. And his slogan, "Black is Beautiful," became a kind of real powerful message for empowerment. And he criticised effectively Western colonialism, which is an expansionist nationalism, which had denied that. And racism, and instilled a sense of shame and self-hatred in black people, and argued that psychological liberation was essential for political freedom, very much in the same way that Frantz Fanon, for example, argued. Garvey's Pan-Africanism was also another key one of his ideas, and it promoted the idea that Africans across the globe, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, of course often in the Americas, were people with a shared destiny and history of oppression. And he argued that African progress would only be possible if different communities and cultures of Africans put aside their cultural and ethnic differences and united in common purpose. And he encouraged African Americans to return to the continent, introducing the Back to Africa plan in 1920. So he's very much active rather than just a theorist as well. So his Pan-African was inclusive, as it rejected ethnic and cultural loyalties in favour of broader African identity. And he argued that the artificial borders and nation states created by expansionist nationalism and European colonial powers had no legitimacy and were designed to divide and oppress rather than reflect the will of the people. So he rejected these imposed identities and instead promoted an internationalist vision of global African unity based on race and the collective experience of oppression by white colonialists and then liberation from that. It really promoted cooperation and unity between African states, and in many ways that's an internationalist vision, as we looked at and are going to look at further in the final part of the video too. Okay, the final part of this video then is where we're going to have a look at the key principles and ideas, but also key divisions within nationalism. We're going to go through these notes a little bit quicker because we've already effectively looked at a lot of the key information and beliefs of each strand. I'm now going to show you effectively how they relate to the core principles, and this is going to form a lot of the key agreement paragraphs and points and disagreement paragraphs and points within your essay. It's also going to be I've also shot this slightly differently to some of the other ideologies notes that I've done, because for me, nation, self-determination, and the nation state, there are core agreements, and we're going to have a look at those. But then in terms of looking at culturalism, racialism, internationalism, but also some other core divisions within nationalism, it's then best to look at those kind of as separate disagreements, and a lot of them relate to nation self-determination and the nation state rather than just relating to one. So we're going to have a look at those three key agreements first, and then look at a lot of those key disagreements within nationalism. So, and of course we're going to finish off by having a look at the state, society, economy, and the human nature, and how you can put these into key points in relation to those, and also in relation to the key principles. So, first looking at these core principles, ideas, and agreements then, and the first one is nations. So effectively, before the rise of nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, political authority was rarely based on the idea of the nation, and nations were a less significant idea. It was based more on power, and legitimacy was based more on monarchies or empires based on divine right, dynasties, kind of history was passed down, families, or on conquest in the case of imperialism. Monarchies and empires, such as the French monarchy or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled over diverse populations, often from different nations and with different cultures, with little concern for shared language, culture, or identity. A lot of the time, the subject owed loyalty not to a nation, but to that ruler or to that dynasty a lot of the time. Nationalism, however, effectively comes in, and the nation is really central to political formation. It argues that the nation, which refers to people who identify themselves as a cohesive group based on shared values in society and a shared sense of belonging, is really, really key. That's central to how they see all of politics, all of society, the state, economy, human nature, everything is effectively based on the nation, as you can expect from the name. So whilst nationalists, as we'll see, disagree strongly over how a nation should be defined, they all fundamentally agree that a nation is the central unit of political organisation and the most important source of loyalty and identity for individuals. Nations are real, meaningful communities that give people purpose, identity, and security. And as we'll explore below, different nationalists highlight different things as the basis of nationhood, including shared values, participation in civil life, shared cultural ethnicity, shared language, traditions or history, and shared religion or ancestry. So there's different things that are seen as the basis of the nation, but they fundamentally agree that the nation is important. As we're going to have a look at now, they fundamentally agree that politics should be based around the nation, and that's through self-determination and the nation state. So central principle of nationalism is self-determination, the belief that nations themselves should have the right to determine how they're governed. Nationalists argue that a nation is not just a cultural community, but should be a political community. The nation should be the basis of politics. With a collective will, the nation has a collective will, and it should be able, therefore, to self-determine, to shape its own destiny and decide on its own future, rather than that being dictated to it by a monarch or an empire, as it was previously, for example. And this is rooted in the nationalist view that nations are coherent and capable political units who have a right to govern themselves in line with their own values, interests, and that collective will. For Mazzini, really key here is his idea that people can only be free in their own nation state. As we've looked at a number of times now, so I'm not going to go through this in loads of detail again, but effectively, people are moral and social creatures. Without a nation state, they're not free, they're powerless and unable to shape their future, and they can only fully realize themselves and be completely free when they can determine their own future as part of a nation. They can have those shared identities and values, and they can feel really part of something through nationalism and self-determination. Nationhood and the nation state is really, really key to that. Of course, Mazzini is a liberal nationalist, so that's not based on kind of cultural or historical values. It's more based on shared. Sorry, it is based on values, not based on kind of culturalism, but it's based on shared values and it's inclusive. That's one of the disagreements we're going to have a look at later. And of course, as I've mentioned a number of times, this is closely linked to the nation state, which is a political formation in which the nation governs itself within a defined territorial boundary. So within the state, so the nation controls the state and runs it in the interests of the nation. This is, of course, as I spoke about, very different to the type of political formations you had before the emergence of nationalism. So nationalists argue that each nation should have its own state, which reflects its identity, protects its interests, and allows it to shape its own political and economic future without external interference. And crucially, this means that a nation isn't being dictated to by foreign imperialism. It isn't powerless. Instead, a nation of people with a kind of shared sense of belonging can control their own laws, borders, military, and the economy, and run them in their own interests. Nationalists believe this will naturally lead to stability and order, as those within a nation have a shared outlook and shared interests. This is central to both liberal nationalists, who see the nation state as rational and democratic, and the expression of the general will, and conservative nationalists as well, who view it as a safeguard of historical identity and social order. So those agreements are really, really important to understanding, because as we're going to see, there's a major disagreements between the strands of nationalism. However, these are the key things they're going to agree on, and therefore the vast majority of the time they're going to be the agreement in the agreement paragraph. So if you're speaking, for example, about to what extent do they agree on society, you say they fundamentally agree on the idea of the nation, and you can link that very much link that into the idea of self-determination as well, and link that into the nation state. Similarly, if you're speaking about human nature, the fundamental agreement is that people effectively belong to nations and can fully realize themselves within nations, and it's exactly the same for the state and a lot of these other essays and essay topics as well, as we're going to look at the end of the video. So yeah, know those really well and be able to explain them, and of course they're interlinked, which is why I've kind of put them together rather than going through differences between them. What we're going to have a look at now is effectively 6 key divisions on these principles and on others which are really important to understanding nationalism. And because of the nature of nationalism, as we mentioned, it's a chameleon ideology at the start which attaches itself to different ideologies. This results in major disagreements within nationalism, and in most of your essays it's going to be effectively one paragraph on agreement. But probably, obviously, look at the essay writing course I've done in terms of the structure of videos, but mainly kind of 2 key paragraphs on disagreement, because these disagreements are really, really significant. As I mentioned, we'll go through them a bit quicker than the earlier notes. There's a lot of repetition in terms of the content. We're now just kind of analysing it in terms of how there can be seen to be agreements or disagreements. And the first key one we're going to have a look at is inclusive versus exclusive nationalism, which is a really, really key difference, particularly between kind of liberal nationalism and anti and post-colonialism on one side, and conservative nationalism, which emerged kind of a reaction in large part to inclusive nationalism, and expansionist nationalism on the other side, and they're both exclusive. So liberal nationalism is kind of, as we've looked at already, a form of inclusive nationalism. National identity isn't based on culture, race, ethnicity, or religion. It's based on shared values. And effectively, anyone who subscribes to the liberal values of the state, such as liberty and equality, and actively participates can be part of the nation, regardless of their background. It's civic, and really key to that, a key kind of thinker as an example you can bring in for that is Rousseau's civic nationalism. I'm not going to go through that again because we've looked at that a number of times, but effectively, the idea is that nationhood is based on the active participation of its citizens and commitment to shared values, and they have together they'll have a general will, the collective will of the people, and that effectively means that the nation is inclusive. Anyone who actively participates and shares those values can join the nation. Anti and post-colonialism can also be seen as inclusive nationalism, as they strongly rejected colonial rule and its racial hierarchy. This has been extremely exclusive nationalism and denied the right of colonized people to self-determination and inclusion within nations or within nation states. And they therefore countered this and argued that colonized people had their own distinct cultures, histories, and identities and had the right to self-determination. They should be included. It's therefore a very inclusive and rational form of nationalism against colonialism and imperialism, driven in part by expansionist nationalism, as we'll have a look at, which is extremely exclusive. Key to this is Garvey and Black Pride is a really good example from a thinker you can use of this. He effectively encouraged African people and those of African descent to reject the colonial mentality that viewed them as inferior, and emphasised an inclusive form of nationalism that argued they construct their own nations and be included. And he therefore encouraged black communities to take pride in their race, culture, and heritage, which he kind of summarised in his slogan, "Black is beautiful," and really used to criticise Western colonialism and racism and imperialism, which had effectively denied this nationalism. It's been exclusive, denied this nationalism to those of African descent. Conservative nationalism then is the key disagreement. It's a very exclusive form of nationalism, as we've had a look at. Unlike liberal nationalism, which sees national identity as civic and open to anyone who shares the nation's values, conservative nationalism defines a nation through shared history, culture, and traditions that are already there. It's not a political construct that anyone can join. The nation belongs to an existing community that's developed over centuries with a shared language, religion, geography, and culture, and therefore you can't just join it based on having shared values. It's based on a culture and based on the past. And even though there can be some assimilation into it, that's very difficult and very slow. Effectively, it's a very exclusive form of nationalism. Herder's cultural nationalism is a really, obviously we're going to look at culturalism in more detail later on, but Herder's cultural nationalism is a really good thinker you can bring in, conservative thinker you can bring in to illustrate this. And he effectively rejected the idea of inclusive nationalism and argued that actually each nation had its own unique cultural character with its own language, culture, and history shaped by the folk, the people, and the folk guides the national identity. And effectively argued that a nation should be based in this history, based in this existing historic current cultural life of a people, and can't be artificially created through civic nationalism. Nations can't be created like liberal nationalists argue. And they shouldn't be inclusive like liberal nationalists argue. They're not changeable. Each has its own culture and way of seeing the world, and that should be protected. It's not like anyone could join. Expansionist nationalism then goes even further. It's extremely exclusive, racist nationalism. And rather than supporting the liberal nationalist idea that all people have a right to self-determination, we're going to look at this in even more detail later, expansionist nationalists believe that only certain nations were truly fit to govern. It's therefore an extremely exclusive and deeply irrational form of nationalism. It's denied nationhood to less civilized nations and effectively argued in terms of national superiority that this nation is superior and therefore has a right to impose its culture on other nations who are seen as inferior. And of course, racial superiority, the ideas of racial superiority really came into that justification. So expansionist nationalism turned nationalism into justification for imperialism, and it's particularly evident in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was kind of the real dividing up of other parts of the world, particularly the scramble for Africa, and argued that some nations had this national superiority and a historical mission and the right to dominate others. So a very exclusive form of nationalism that rejected the agency of colonized people. The next key difference we're going to have a look then at, which is very much linked into this, is rationalism versus culturalism. And a lot of these differences are linked in. You'll see similar themes within them. Of course, you need to decide the particular way you explain them, and why I've separated them is that some of them are more useful for different essays, particularly on the state or society or the economy, for example. So culturalism is the belief that nationalism should be based on shared culture, including common language, history, traditions, and values. So emphasise emotional and historical ties to the nation and sees national identity as organic and inherited rather than something that can be artificially created. So this is very much linked to this kind of exclusive nationalism, and we just had a look at. It's a key reason. for it. And as we're going to have a look at, it strongly supported this idea of culturalism by the exclusive nationalists, by conservative nationalists, expansionist nationalists, but certainly not by liberal nationalists. So conservative nationalism strongly supports culturalism, as it rejects the liberal nationalist idea that a nation can be creative and nationalism can be inclusive. Instead, it defines a nation as belonging to an existing community. As we looked at, this developed over centuries, and national identity, something that a person has and binds together in the existing community, rather than something that can be kind of created or chosen through shared values. So we're going to look at liberal nationalists disagree with that. And this also is key to human nature. This is a really important point you can bring in relation to human nature. This has reflected the conservative nationalism's far more pessimistic view of human nature. They believe that people are emotional, irrational, and needed guidance and shared identity, rather than being rational beings who could create a nation state through that civic involvement and active participation. As we said, some outsiders can join the nation, but it's very, very difficult. But yeah, they effectively see human nature as irrational, therefore you can't create that value. Actually, people are emotional, irrational, they need guidance, and we need to listen to the existing communities and identities and nations that are there. They're the basis for nationhood, they're the basis for self-determination, they're the basis for the nation state. It's not something that can be created through shared values. Herder's really key to that, due to his strong support, of course, for cultural nationalism. Of course, we've looked at this a number of times now. The argument that nations aren't artificial or changeable. Each has its own unique cultural character and way of seeing the world that should be protected and respected. Culturalism is really key to the founding of nationhood, and as he mentioned, the folk, the people, and the national spirit are really key to that. They have a unique kind of shared language, culture, and a history of traditions that give the nation its unique character. You can't kind of create this. The nation state's role is to give political expression to this existing nation, which has this existing national spirit. The nation's role isn't to try and create it effectively. Expansionist nationalists and some conservative nationalists, so the more extreme ones we've had a look at, don't just believe in culturalism, they go even further and really believe in cultural superiority. So some extreme conservative nationalists effectively believe in cultural superiority, which is xenophobic and sought to kind of revive, glorify often mythical version of the past, which they see has been corrupted by foreign influence a lot of the time. So they're regressive nationalists, and they effectively are strongly supportive of culturalism, and they believe that the reason for a nation and what founds nationhood is this existing culture, but they really venerate it and effectively argue that this existing culture is superior to any other cultures, and they use that effectively to justify excluding outsiders such as immigrants who don't share that culture. But this also leads to imperialism and colonization, as they believe in this cultural superiority and therefore use that to justify imperialism, colonization, conquest, and imposition of this culture on people who have different cultures, who they define as inferior or uncivilized. And they really subjugate these different groups. Marist is a key thinker you can bring into this, both for this kind of ultra-conservative element, but also for expansionists. He clearly had a pessimistic view of human nature, as his integral nationalism argued that individuals should not see themselves as autonomous beings, but as members of a collective nation to which they owe complete loyalty. And that links in very much this kind of idea of cultural superiority and then national superiority. And effectively, national unity can only be achieved by purging the nation of internal enemies as well. This is, of course, also linked into expansionist nationalism, as chauvinist nationalism, a key part of expansionist nationalism, asserted the absolute superiority of one nation over the other. It shares the exact same view in terms of cultural and national superiority, and that was, of course, used then to justify imperialism. And that was, of course, irrational and emotional in the same way that the culturalism of conservative nationalism is, and that's where we can see it as a key difference in relation to human nature, particularly with what we're going to have a look at here with liberal nationalism. So liberal nationalism supported the idea of rationalism, and this is very different. It's not doesn't have a pessimistic view of human nature. Instead, it's a very optimistic, positive view of human nature. It views them as capable of reasoned self-government, and as a result, believes that they can rationally create a nation and a nation state based on shared values and rights. And therefore, as we've looked at, membership of that nation is inclusive. It's based on rational commitment to these rights and active participation. It's not based on culturalism. So that's where we really see they believe in rationalism rather than culturalism. And you see that rejection of culturalism, and you can see that, for example, in Rousseau's civic nationalism, which was inclusive. Anyone who commits himself to the shared values of the nation can join. It's not based on this kind of existing culture. Interestingly, with post or anti-colonialism or anti-colonial nationalism, there's a bit of a mixed picture. So anti-colonial nationalism can be seen as somewhat supportive of culturalism, as it rejects colonialism, which denied the culture of colonized people, and argued that colonized people had their own distinct cultures, histories, and identities, which they should be able to realize through self-determination. So colonial rule was seen as culturally destructive, as it erased indigenous identities and way of life and enforced inferiority. And this is, of course, supported, for example, by Garvey's Black Pride, this idea that should be fought back against, and actually black people and those of African descent have their own existing cultures which have been denied by colonialism, and they should be realised through anti-colonialism in opposition to Western imperialism. On the other hand, though, post-colonial nationalism can be seen as much closer to rationalism in many ways, and that's because effectively the states that post-colonial national leaders had to run often had very kind of illogical borders. There, as actual territorial states, were often the result of being created, artificially created, for example, in the Berlin Conference, by European powers. A lot of them had straight lines and therefore combined a large multitude of different ethnic, linguistic, and cultural. So they cut across these lines and include lots of different cultural groups. And as a result, this kind of post-colonial nationalism can be seen as rationalism, as these leaders, for example, Nyerere and Nkrumah, as we looked at closer to the start of the video, effectively had to create national identities and create nation states for these new nations, which had very little in common apart from that shared experience of colonialism, as the actual territory of the nation states were often created by colonialism or embedded, affected by colonialism, and therefore it can be seen as a bit opposed to it. It can be seen that that's rationalism; it's creating a new state rather than being culturalist. And further, Pan-Africanism can be seen as opposed to culturalism, as it sought to unite African people across national borders and across cultural differences. So Garvey argued that African progress would only be possible if communities put aside their cultural and ethnic differences and united in a common purpose. Linked to these first two is the next one we're going to have a look at, and that's whether nationalism, the different nationalisms are regressive or progressive. And this is really important. This has actually been asked as a question previously on the paper. To what extent is nationalism regressive? I think this is a key kind of dividing line and question that you're going to want to have a look at. So progressive nationalism links to democracy, the future, and the creation of something new, whilst regressive nationalism effectively is the idea that it looks back to the past and often legitimizes greater state control and authoritarianism as a result. So it's not completely linked. They link a bit to kind of democracy versus authoritarianism as well. Liberal nationalism is very much progressive. It's applying the ideas of liberalism to the nation, and just as liberals should be able to determine their own lives, liberals believe that individuals should be able to determine their own lives. Liberal nationalists believe that entire peoples and nations and communities should be able to determine their own destiny too. And it's really looking to the future. It's about that self-determination. Crucially, they think this can involve the kind of creation of a new nation and creation of an entirely new nation state, as nationhood is inclusive. It's based on a shared commitment to values rather than being based on culturalism, for example. And therefore, liberal nationalism can be seen as progressive and looking forward, as it supports the ability of groups of individuals to determine their own destinies and achieve progress in society. And that can be seen in Rousseau's emphasis on active participation. The key to this creation of the nation and key to liberal nationalism is active participation, the expression of a general will and active participation in democratic processes in particular. We can also bring in Mazzini's action here as well. It's not just about ideas, it's about properly fighting effectively for the nation and creating that nation through collective struggle for Mazzini. Anti- and post-colonial nationalism can also be seen very much as progressive for exactly the same reasons we just talked about for why post-colonial nationalism can be seen as rational rather than cultural, and that's effectively as they needed to create a new politics in the wake of the removal of colonial control, and often colonialism had been culturally and politically destructive, but crucially, they had to create something new, as I spoke about, create an entirely new sense of national identity, as often colonialism had created states that forced lots of different cultures and communities and nations, in a sense, together. That can be seen really clearly, for example, in Nyerere in Tanzania, the idea of Ujamaa as a form of African socialism, as a new source of national identity for Tanzania that sought to bring people together. And it can also be seen in Garvey's Pan-Africanism. There's a vision of African unity, and the idea that these kind of cultural and ethnic differences should be put aside and create something new as African unity. And that's that real, we can say that there's that agreement with liberal nationalism on being progressive. Conservative nationalism, on the other hand, is regressive and often authoritarianism. So all conservative nationalists are in some sense regressive. They're not trying to create something new. In fact, they're a reaction to this liberal nationalist desire to create something new, as they look to the past and effectively argue, no, you can't create something new. You can't create a nation through shared commitment to values, in liberal values, for example. Instead, nations are based on the past. They're based on the status quo and what's already there. So effectively, conservative nationalists feared that a nation state based on rationalism and inclusive nationalism threatened stability, tradition, and order. That links into that conservative element, as you can see, as I'm sure you've studied conservatism by now. And as a result, they argued that the nation state should be based on the culture, identity, and traditions of the past and the status quo. So that's, in some senses, so all conservatives are regressive. They're certainly not progressive. But also, when we speak about are they progressive or regressive, there's also a specific subgroup of regressive nationalism, kind of extreme conservative nationalists, and they go much closer to expansionist nationalism. And this is a more extreme, reactionary, often xenophobic version of conservative nationalism. So while conservatives may wish to preserve national identity, regressive nationalists actively seek to revive a glorified, often mythical version of this past. It's this kind of use of national myths and national history we spoke about to justify ideas of national superiority and cultural superiority. And it often presents the nation in absolute sacred terms and demands total loyalty to its culture. So as we look at with Charles Maurras. So his idea of integral nationalism is highly authoritarian. It believes that individuals shouldn't see themselves as autonomous beings, and that sees it as quite regressive. It's linked into authoritarianism. Effectively, the nation is the most important thing. You have to completely subject yourself to the nation, submerge yourself to the nation. Obviously, Maurras looks back to Louis XIV, for example. And key to this is militarism, his belief in a strong military ethos, and it's about defence, and that links into that authoritarianism as well. So you have a strong defence, strong military power, and that creates the nation as well through national service. It gives the nation a sense of purpose and sacrifice. Expansionist nationalism, exactly the same. It is very regressive. Chauvinistic nationalism, a key part of it, is rooted in the past, fueled by myths of past military triumphs and national destiny. With history distorted effectively to kind of create this narrative of national superiority. And this leads to the belief that the nation is inherently exceptional, morally, culturally, and usually racially. And they use it as justification, as we've seen already. They see it as gives them the right to impose their culture, impose their nation on others through imperialism. It's a highly authoritarian and militarized form of nationalism with little space for dissent against his overarching narrative of national superiority, as you can see with Japanese imperialism and Nazi Germany, as we looked at. So yeah, progressive nationalism is very much liberal nationalism, anti and post-colonialism, but conservative nationalism is certainly regressive, and even then further, you have certain parts of conservative nationalism, extreme conservative nationalism, which are very regressive, as is expansionist nationalism. Moving on then now to the next key division, and that's internationalism versus nationalism. So internationalism is similar to culturalism, another one of these core principles, but it's certainly not something that all nationalists agree on, or it can be said that even some elements of so conservative nationalism and expansionist nationalism, none of their elements can be seen as internationalists. That's why we're really seeing it as a key division here. At the end of the day, we're going to look at where you could bring in some area of agreement if you're going to do it in an essay on it effectively. So liberal internationalism, liberal nationalism effectively has an international element. So liberal nationalism doesn't reject internationalism as some other strands of nationalism do. and they see it as translating to liberal internationalism. And Mazzini, for example, argued that Europe should be based on a loose federation of nation states who had a shared commitment to liberal values. So effectively argued that the world should be organised around these independent, self-governing nation states, and the majority of the time these will be left alone just to work things out themselves, but there will also be this cooperation between nation states through international organisations to promote these liberal values and cooperate on these legal values such as peace, democracy, and human rights. And these international organisations can help cooperation between nation states across borders for mutual benefit and to help poorer nations uplift themselves, as economic cooperation and global economic growth is beneficial for all states. So that's really key. They believe that economic cooperation and cooperation on liberal values is really key to benefiting all states, but also uplifting poorer states, and therefore helping across nations. This may also sometimes make it necessary to sanction a particular state if it infringes upon the liberal rights and values of its citizens or another state. And you see that with, for example, the European Union and the United States, which they strongly support as they encourage cooperation between different nations to pursue liberal values, whilst also not really imposing their will on those nation states. There's still self-determination and autonomy is still maintained for those nation states. Post-colonial nationalism can be seen as kind of supportive of both nationalism and internationalism. And that can be seen as particularly in support for socialism. So this is really key in relation to the if you're doing essays on the economy, effectively. Post-colonial nationalism often draws on socialist thought, as many nationalist leaders viewed global capitalism as central to colonial exploitation. And this led to support for national economies based on socialism through the power of the state, and we've seen looked at Nkrumah and Nyerere as examples of this. And you can see that here, examples for Nkrumah and Ghana, also for Nyerere, but we've already had a look at that. But also that led to internationalism, this idea of socialist internationalism and Pan-Africanism as well. So post-colonial African leaders supported solidarity between oppressed peoples and post-colonial states and nations across the world that sought to work with other post-colonial nations to resist imperialism, global capitalism, and to promote equality. And post-colonial nationalism therefore didn't reject internationalism, instead it embraced international cooperation, similar to liberal nationalism between post-colonial states, and that's particularly socialist internationalism, because it was about resisting the legacies of imperialism and resisting global capitalism in particular. And this internationalism can also very much be seen in Pan-Africanism, where Garvey really supported the idea that African states should put their differences aside and work together to create effectively a continent that was working together for the interests of Africa and for African progress. And they should put together their cultural differences, and it was an internationalist vision of global African unity based on race and the collective experience of oppression by white colonialists, and then of course the liberation. Conservative nationalism, on the other hand, is not internationalist. It didn't have an internationalist element. Instead, it focused solely on promoting the interests of the nation through the nation state and the economy. And of course, we looked at it as exclusive and sought to promote social stability and guard the nation from external threats. And this was reinforced by Herder's cultural nationalism, as he didn't believe in this shared values that could actually transcend, not only create the nation, but transcend the nation and bind nations together. Instead, each nation's got its own cultural character, and that's why conservative nationalists aren't internationalists. They really focus just on the nation. And you have extreme nationalism at the end of the extreme end of conservative nationalism as well, as we looked at, where they believe in national superiority. They see other nations as threats and outsiders, and present the nation's sacred terms or demands complete loyalty, but also justified kind of action against immigrants, for example, minorities. And supranational institutions, which they see as a threat to national purity and cohesion. And it also led to the justification for imperialism abroad, based on this idea of national superiority. It was really about prioritizing national interests, effectively. And that can be seen, this kind of focus solely on the nation can be seen in the centrality of militarism to Maoist integral nationalism. You can bring him in as a thinker to support this. For him, a strong military was key to nationalism and the nation state, as it forged a sense of purpose, sacrifice, and national identity. And he supported rearmament, national service, and authoritarian rule as a means to restore France's former greatness as he saw it. Expansionist nationalism exactly the same, as we've seen a lot of times with this extreme end of conservative nationalism, that also believed in national superiority. Um, it rejected internationalism by focusing solely on the nation and even believing in kind of the idea that national superiority gave it the right one nation to conquer and colonize others by these kind of myths of national superiority, and that led and justified imperialism, as we've seen. The next key disagreement we're going to have a look at, very much linked to this then, is actually to what extent they believe in self-determination. Not for themselves, they all believe in self-determination for their own nation, as we've looked at as a key agreement, but for other nations. And effectively what we see here is that expansionist nationalism doesn't support the idea that all peoples have a right to self-determination, all nations have a right to self-determination. Instead, they justify the idea that only their nation is fit to govern, and use that effectively to justify imperialism and conquest, and in the imposition of one nation on another, on other nations. And this was through imperialism, and they justified this by saying that other nations were inferior and less civilized, and therefore didn't have the right to self-determination in the same way. So expansionist nationalism turned nationalism into justification for imperialism, and argued that some nations, based on national superiority and these ideas of historical the historical right, historical destiny, historical ideas of military power, had a historical mission and natural right to dominate other nations. Conservative nationalism was supportive of self-determination, though. It argued that existing nations based on history, culture, and traditions should be able to form nation-states, and that the shared will and unique character of the people should form the basis of the nation. So the vast majority of conservative nationalists were supportive of self-determination and didn't seek to impose it on other nations. And you can see that belief in self-determination in Herder, the idea of the folk and the Volksgeist, this unique cultural character of each nation that should have that right to self-determine and make decisions for itself. However, what you also see is that some of the more extreme versions of nationalism were more similar to expansionist nationalism, and therefore justified imperialism and denied self-determination for other states in the same way as expansionist nationalism. So the more extreme elements of conservative nationalism believed in national superiority and were willing to ignore the right of other nations to self-determination through imperialism exactly the same way as expansionist nationalism, and exactly the same way that was driven by ideas of national and cultural superiority. Liberal nationalism, on the other hand, is strongly supportive of self-determination. It applies the key ideas of liberalism to the nation, and just as individuals should be able to determine their own lives, it believes that nations and entire communities should be able to determine their own national destiny too. So it's strongly supportive of national self-determination, as we've had a look at a number of times. It also believes that these nations and states can be created through shared values, and it's therefore strongly opposed to imperialism and expansionist nationalism. Of course, you can bring in Mazzini here, the idea that humans can only be free in their own nation state. And anti and post-colonialism were, of course, absolutely strongly opposed to self-determination. They're strongly supportive of self-determination, and strongly opposed to imperialism, which had denied them self-determination. That's the alleged colonial rule, this idea of civilizing missions driven by this expansionist imperialism. And racial hierarchy denied them self-determination. And anti-colonialism and post-colonialism were strongly supportive of the idea that actually no, that's why they supported inclusive nationalism, that African nations, or for Garvey, kind of Pan-African nations, Pan-Africanism has the right to self-determination to determine its own political future and its own political destiny, free of colonialism. So that's a key difference between expansionist nationalism and some extreme elements of conservative nationalism, which deny self-determination for others, whereas the rest of nationalists are strongly supportive of self-determination for all. The final key difference we're going to have a look at then, so there's been 6 in total, this is the 6th, is racialism. And this again is highlighted as one of the key strands, one of the key principles, and ideas in the specification, but it's certainly not something that's supported, can be seen as an agreement or principle supported by all of nationalism. So racism is the belief that humankind can be meaningfully divided into separate races, which each possess different natures. And this can be neutral, as it is with Garvey, who justified the separation of black Africans from their white oppressors. And we're going to see that in post and anti-colonial nationalism. Racism was used somewhat to kind of effectively, as part of nationalism, this idea of black pride, of African nations, should have the right to after it was denied by imperialism, but that's certainly not racism, and that's where they disagree with a small group of expansionist nationalism, which are deeply racist, and nationalist powers such as Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, who use racism as justification for imperialism and genocide. So expansionist and regressive nationalism use racism as justification for nativism and imperialism. As the most extreme forms of conservative nationalism and expansionist nationalism support racism and use it to justify both nativism at home and violent imperialism abroad. And these are both linked to kind of cultural national superiority, which are linked in and supported by what they believe in racial superiority. So in terms of imperialism, expansionist nationalism rejects the belief that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and they argue that only certain nations and races are fit to govern. That's where that racialism and ideas of racial superiority justifies imperial expansion and the domination of others who are, and that's justified by saying that others are less civilized and inferior nations and inferior races, effectively. And that can be seen in particular in European imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Crucially, though, this also leads to racism within the nation, with immigrants and minorities of other races portrayed as enemies who threaten the nation state and threaten this idea of national superiority, and that leads to violent action and economic policies against these groups, particularly nativism. So Maoist integral nationalism argued that individuals should be completely beholden to the state and the national mission, and that true national unity often involved purging the nation of internal enemies, including minority groups he considered disloyal. And nativism is really key economically as well and politically, is it argued that only those born within the nation from a particular racial group were true members of the community and were racially superior, and that was used as justification to give them privileged access to the state and to the economy. This took the form of racialized economic policies, racist in Nazi Germany, that prioritized ethnic Germans and excluded Jews, Roma, and other minority groups. Nazis promoted the idea of the people's community in which economic resources, employment, and welfare were reserved for those deemed racially pure, particularly the Aryan race, whilst Jewish citizens, for example, were stripped of their rights, professions, and property, and subjected to genocide. So economic nationalism under the Nazis was used as a tool for racial purification and for genocide. Moving on to anti- and post-colonial nationalism, or anti- and post-colonialism then. They certainly obviously don't believe in racism. However, race and racialism can be seen as a kind of an important part of their nationalism and their ideology. So they certainly don't believe in racial superiority. However, they did encourage colonized people to reject narratives of racial inferiority of colonized people that were promoted by imperial powers and throw off their white oppressors and construct after it their own nations and nation states. So Garvey, for example, emphasized the importance of black pride, and that's where racism is important as part of their nationalism. He encouraged African people and those of African descent to reject the colonial mentality that viewed them as inferior or dominated them, and urged them to take pride in their race, culture, and heritage. And that was key to their ideas of nationalism as well. So he criticized the way that Western colonialism and racism and instilled a sense of shame and self-hatred in black people, and his slogan, "Black is Beautiful," became a powerful message for empowerment for anti-colonial nationalists. So racism can also be seen, not racism, racialism, can also be seen in post-colonial nationalism, in particular Garvey's theory of Pan-Africanism, which promoted the idea that Africans across the globe, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, particularly in the Americas, were one people with a shared destiny and history of oppression. And he opposed cultural divisions and supported a global African unity based on race and the collective experience of oppression. And he encouraged this practically by encouraging African Americans to return to the continent by introducing the Back to Africa plan in 1920. Liberal nationalists and conservative nationalists, for them, racism is less important. So liberal conservative nationalism is exclusive and culturalist, but this is based on culture, tradition, and hierarchy and history rather than race. Though it's difficult for people to join the nation, they can do so through assimilation. And liberal nationalism isn't racialist, as it's inclusive and believes that any individual who shares the liberal values of the nation state and participates actively can be part of the nation. So yeah, that was obviously a long part of this video looking at the key kind of 3 key agreements, but 6 key divisions. Of course, there's quite a bit of repetition and shared ideas within them. It's really useful to understand those divisions, in particular due to where you can bring them into these essays. So effectively, these are not going to be full essay plans. There are some full essay plans on the website which you can purchase as part of nationalism, but these are going to be the key agreements and principles and disagreement points that you could then bring into your essays on nationalism. So in terms of the state, one of the key agreements is that the nation is the key unit around which politics should be organised through the nation state and broad support for self-determination. Whereas key disagreements, you can look at whether membership of the nation state is inclusive and based on rationalism, or exclusive and based on culturalism. And you can also look at whether there's an international element, whether it goes beyond the nation state, or whether the nation is solely focused on nationalism. That's, of course, a disagreement between liberal nationalists who have liberal internationalism, and exactly the same with socialist internationalism, which links into post-colonial and anti-colonialism, versus, for example, conservative and expansionist nationalism. And also key disagreement over supporting the self-determination of other states or ignoring it through expansionist nationalism and imperialism. And that's where expansionist nationalism and some extreme version of conservative nationalism disagree with the other nationalists effectively. That's very similar. I'm going to go down to the core principles to the nation state. It effectively would be the same essay. Of course, you're talking about the nation state rather than the state, but it's very, very similar. In terms of human nature, this is a bit of a difficult one when we're talking about nationalism, because in comparison to some other ideologies, they talk about human nature loads. The key agreement I'd bring in is that people belong and can only be free within the nation. Mazzini is key to illustrating that, which gives them a key sense of belonging, identity, and moral purpose. And that's really important. You see that across the strands of nationalism. Some disagreements, though, are between culturalism, which is based on a more kind of pessimistic view of human nature, which sees it as more irrational and emotional and needing effectively needing that kind of sense of community in the nation, whereas rationalism is based on a more positive view of human nature, supported by liberal nationalists and to some extent post-colonial nationalists who believe that due to this, the fact that they believe that these new nations can be constructed based on shared values and identity, reflects a positive view of human nature. Of course, it involves a positive view of democratic engagement and active participation as well. There's a key disagreement over racialism and whether humans can be meaningfully divided into different races and how this influences nationalism. I think there's a lot that very much relates to human nature, so you can really explain that disagreement. On society, then, there's loads of disagreements we can bring in, because almost anything you can relate to society. A lot of those divisions we had a look at. But the key agreement I'd bring in is that nations are the most important source of loyalty and belonging for individuals, and the most important unit of society around which politics should be organised through nation states. So you'll see with a lot of these agreements is bringing together these agreements on the nation state, and self-determination. Disagreements, though, you can look at the disagreement between exclusive nationalism, which is linked to culturalism, and inclusive nationalism, linked to rationalism. So whether it's inclusive or exclusive nationalism is a really key point in relation to the nation and their views of society. Also, disagreements over whether it's regressive and links into authoritarianism and looks to hark back to the past society, or looks to create something new for the future of society, and is progressive, and that's of course the regressive, and authoritarian is more conservative nationalists in particular, and also expansionist nationalists, whilst liberal nationalists, post-colonial nationalists are on the other side. Disagreement over whether nationalism should have an international element, or whether it should be solely focused on nationalism, including ideas of national superiority. That's a very similar point that you could bring in for the state there, and that, of course, as I mentioned, puts liberal nationalism and, to some extent, Pan-Africanism, post-colonialism, and contrast that with conservative nationalism in particular. And the disagreement over racialism, whether humans can meaningfully divide into races and how this influences nationalism, is a clear point about society in the same way it is about human nature. If you get a question asked, for example, on the key principle of the nation, it's effectively the exact same points that you could bring in, because the nation is very much related to society. The economy, then, I go for this is one of the more difficult ones, because they don't talk about the economy too much. But I go through the agreement that politics should be structured around the nation and nation state, so that the economy would serve the interests of the nation. And then I go, so that's a key agreement, again relating it to the core agreements of the nation and the nation state, and linking it into the economy a little bit as well. Disagreements then, I'd look at how both anti and post-colonial nationalism, support for socialist nationalism and socialist internationalism, and liberal nationalism, support for liberal internationalism, linked to global trade and supporting other states to uplift themselves, how that was a key disagreement with the imperialism of expansionist and extreme conservative nationalism as dependent on global capitalism. So that key disagreement between those in particular on internationalism versus nationalism, but also linked into imperialism as a key economic element. And the key disagreement I'd have a look at as well is between the exclusive nativist approach to the economy of extreme conservative and some expansionist nationalists, when we looked at and that kind of internationalism versus the nationalism and the extreme nativism as well, and the inclusive approach to the nation and the nation state of liberal nationalism, and really contrast that there. In terms of the core principles then, we've already had a look at nations and nation state. In terms of self-determination, you can look at a key agreement that nations have the right to determine themselves how they're governed through self-determination. Nation state, that is an agreement that is shared across all kind of strands of nationalism. Then, of course, key disagreements are over supporting self-determination of other states, which, of course, supported by liberal nationalism, post-colonial and anti-colonial nationalism, or ignoring it, which is, of course, the key expansionist disagreement with the expansionist nationalism, who support racial superiority and imperialism. And also disagreement over whether membership of the state is inclusive and based on rationalism or exclusive due to culturalism and sometimes racism or racialism. Culturalism then, we can go to the agreement, a key agreement again linking to nations, the nation state and self-determination, that nations are the most important source of loyalty and belonging for individuals, and they have shared cultures, values and traditions, and the most important unit of society around which politics should be organised through nation states. So there is that broad agreement. However, that's of course undermined somewhat when we look at the disagreements by the kind of rationalism supported by liberal nationalists, in particular their rejection of culturalism. So culturalism looks back to the past and existing cultures and argues you can't create something new, and that's of course disagreed with. Liberal nationalists of course disagree with that through their support for rationalism, that believe that you can create these new nations and nation states through shared values. You also bring in their disagreement over racialism and cultural or racial superiority. And of course links into self-determination and whether the self-determination of other states is rejected. And that's crucially looking at extreme versions of conservative nationalism and expansionist nationalism and how they disagree with the other strands of nationalism. On racialism then is a really difficult one to get a whole kind of essay out of. I'd just go for two big paragraphs. One, an agreement among the majority of nationalists that racialism isn't central for nationalism. It's difficult to really find an agreement here. So for conservatism, it's about culturalism, whilst for liberal nationalism, rationalism, it's kind of about rationalism and it's completely inclusive. But then look at the key disagreement over racialism as well, how expansionist nationalism see it in terms of racial superiority, which leads to nativism at home and imperialism, how anti and post-colonialism, of course, don't believe in racism, but believe in racialism, and racism is an important part of their nationalism, though, of course, in a neutral way, in an anti-imperial way, and how that disagrees with liberal and cultural. You could either do that just the disagreement between those two, or you could look at it as how that disagreement between those two and how that also disagrees with liberal and conservative nationalists. Internationalism then, again, a really difficult one to bring in, but we can bring in the agreement that the nation is the key unit around which politics should be organised. So even though internationalism, there's some kind of international element to some nationalists, they still fundamentally believe that the nation is key. That's why they're nationalists. Then we've got a disagreement over whether the nation state and nationalism should have an international element. It's a key disagreement over internationalism, or whether it should focus solely on nationalism, and that puts liberal nationalism, which has an internationalist element, in the same way as post and anti-colonialism, against conservative nationalism, in particular in expansionist nationalism, and also a disagreement over the supporting the self-determination of other states, or ignoring it through expansionist nationalism. And that, of course, puts expansionist nationalism and support for imperialism against the other forms of nationalism as the key disagreement. So yeah, that was quite long as well, but looking at some of those key principles, key state, society, economy, human nature, and some of the key agreements and disagreements you can bring in for each. And the final thing we're going to have a look at then is some kind of overall interpretations about whether there's more agreement or disagreement. And these aren't the exact kind of justifications or conclusions you bring into your essays, just ways you could structure arguments and think about it. But of course, you need to think about it and justify it in relation to the particular question, whether it's asking about state, economy, society, human nature, or any of those core principles. But overall, the interpretation that there's more agreement than disagreement is that it can be argued that even though there are obviously disagreements in relation to whether the nation is inclusive or exclusive, there's a fundamental agreement. This is what makes them nationalists, that nations are the key unit of political organisation, and that those within a nation state, nation should have the right to self-determination and the right to a nation state. That's the fundamental agreement, and it's so important. That's what unites them, and effectively the differences between them over whether it's kind of inclusive or exclusive, etc., aren't differences about nationalism. They're differences about different contexts and the other ideologies, whether post-colonialism, conservatism, or liberalism, that nationalism is attached to, as it's a chameleon ideology. So it is a very difficult argument to make that there's more agreement than disagreement, and that's probably how you could go about making it. On the other hand, though, you can of course make quite a persuasive argument that there's clearly more disagreement than agreement in relation to nationalism. And so there might be these broad agreements on the nation state, and self-determination is fundamentally undermined by disagreements over whether there should be internationalism, whether the nation piece should be inclusive and based on racism or exclusive and based on culturalism, and whether the self-determination of all states is supported. And these are really, really big disagreements that actually put these different strands of socialism, not of nationalism, sorry, not in contradiction with other ideologies, but in direct opposition to each other. So cultural nationalism and conservative nationalism is a direct response to the threat it sees liberal nationalism as posing. Sorry, I should say conservative nationalism. Whilst anti-colonial nationalism is driven by a desire is completely opposed to expansionist nationalism, and driven by a desire to remove the oppression of expansionist nationalism. And given this, can we really say there's more agreement among nationalists than there is disagreement? It becomes very, very difficult. So yeah, again, a very long video, as all of these ideologies ones are, but hopefully that gives you everything you need to know. As I said at the start, we looked through introducing the key different strands. Then we looked at the thinkers, and then we've applied it to these key agreements and disagreements, and looked at the end how you could apply that to potential things you could get asked about, say, society, economy, human nature, and the core principles as well. I really hope it was useful. Please let me know in the comment section below if you've got any comments or questions. Go to the Politics Explained website if you want to purchase these PDF notes to work from, and also it comes as a package with some essay plans as well, which would be really helpful for some of the key questions you could get asked. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.